Um, and with that, I would get started. Hand over to you, Darcy, and let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. Hi, everybody. I'm Darcy Boles. My home base is in San Diego, California, where I work out of, and I travel quite a bit too. But I am a remote first work consultant. So I help companies with understanding how to codify their culture remotely, create workplace experience design. So, really, what is the experience when there's no office? My background is in big tech. I was at Airbnb for 4 years, so I take a lot of kind of lessons from hospitality of how do we create a really welcoming and environment focused on belonging, as well as I was at Stripe and Taxjar for 4 years. So, which Taxjar was a fully remote company pre-pandemic. So have a lot of lessons that I've learned, things not to do, things to do, and I am an open book. So feel free to ask any questions, and I'm excited. Let's get started, Julian.
Yeah, let's get right to the meat and potatoes of remote manager mistakes and improvements. So, I think one thing that's very practical, a very practical question is if you start working when you start working with remote teams and remote companies, where do you often see that managers can make the biggest improvements to their team's remote work experience?
Yeah, I think number one is modeling the behavior that they want to see. I think that's probably the absolute number one thing. People are coming into remote environments from all different backgrounds. They don't have a shared knowledge of what the working experience should be like. So I'll give you an example. One of my first weeks working remotely as a lead, and a new employee came to me. I used to meet with every single new employee, and they said, "What do I need to do if I need to go to the bathroom?" I was shocked, right? This is an adult that they had come into this remote first environment, but the background they had come from had been so stringent, it had been so micromanaged, it had been a terrible office environment that they had been watched the entire working career of their life. And so that taught me as a manager, I need to give over permission to my team to reiterate it's okay to take time away from your computer. It's okay to do all of these things. So I really think modeling that behavior, the behavior you want to see over permitting. Language is so important here. When people say, "Oh, I'm so sorry I didn't get back to you quickly," as a manager saying, "Please don't ever say sorry to me. I trust that you'll get back to me when you can." That repetition of language and kind of over permitting is a huge, huge kind of way to unlock remote team performance.
Hmm. Do you see people writing that down in like a kind of a culture notebook?
Yeah,
So
absolutely. I
you
mean,
can sit down and like think of the 10 things that are really important to you, or do you think things that maybe don't matter so much to you?
yeah, I mean, I think one of the number one things that I tell teams I work with as well is if your culture isn't written down, it actually doesn't, it exists, but culture is a feeling. And so you have to write your culture down and understand it when you're going remote so people can come into the environment and actually know and be able to operate at their best because they know what the framework is and how they can have freedom within that framework. So I think when we're in an office, you walk in and you know where the walls are, you know where the bathroom is, you know where the marketing team sits, right? Like everything is kind of obvious. And in remote, that doesn't exist. And so even the smallest things, the tiniest behaviors, everything kind of from soup to nuts should be written down. And we assume kind of as just human beings, we've worked in an office environment that everybody's going to operate and they know how to operate. That's not the case in a remote environment. And so I can't
Hmm.
reiterate that enough is really writing down and behaving within the structure that you've written down. You can kind of use it as a compass for yourself.
Hmm. Where do you think people should start writing things down? Because to me, I immediately think, whoa, that's overwhelming. There's probably a million things I could write down, but like, where do I start, and how do I make sure it's not just empty phrases in there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'd start with if you're a leader in a company that obviously, hopefully your values align with because you're leading at that company. I would hope that all leaders are kind of keeping and maintaining roles where they really truly feel like they're intrinsically motivated. I would say writing the values down. And then one question I think is really important for leaders to ask themselves in a remote environment is, can I identify where these values show up? So can you start to write down moments where you see the values lived and breathed, and then sharing those with your team? So is one of your values being accountable? Awesome. Where do you see accountability show up from your CEO or show up from your other leaders? And then sharing that with your team. Here's an example of what accountability looks like in our company.
That makes a lot of sense. And one question related to that, not just the documentation, but also when it comes to culture, writing down values. I always feel like it's kind of and also looking at you, Tizé, because he's our HR manager. Like, where does the responsibility of the team lead end, and where does HR's begin? Because I don't want to step on anyone's toes, but at the same time, I want to make sure that I document things they work for my team, which might not be the way it works for everyone at the company.
Yeah, I mean, my answer might be differ from other people's. I think that one of the most important things is that a strong culture is actually co-created through everybody. Ideally, at some point, especially at the beginning, you should be hiring people specifically for the values in which the company espouses. And one of the most powerful things I've said to teams of over 300 that really sticks is culture is the co-creation responsibility of everybody in this company. And if it just becomes one person's responsibility or HR's responsibility, it will never live and breathe because it will be an other than. And culture is really kind of the pillars of the house that you all are building together. And you are all responsible for holding that house up and keeping the lights on.
That is very interesting. Thank you. So again, I know I asked this with documentation, but where do you start? Where do you start with kind of defining this culture? And if you're not really sure what it is and you don't have good documentation, do you have any resources for getting started or any starting points?
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one starting point is really, culture is also a reflection and of how the leadership team and the senior leadership team and the founding team has built the foundation of the company. And it starts to really kind of go out like this, right? And you may have felt this, you all may have felt this in companies that you've been in that have grown quickly, that culture actually shifts every 7 people that you hire. So you can actually feel the shift. You can start to feel where it starts to move in different directions. And so I would say really starting with that founding team, starting with the senior leadership team, and starting again, coming back to that question of, are the values that this company is built on, do we feel them? Where do we feel them? Where do we see them? How are they experienced? I think one question, if your team is smaller and you're willing to do this work, this is a great question to ask all of your team members, is, can you write a postcard to me about what it feels like to work here? Get everybody's postcards, right? That's an async activity. What are the themes that you see? Do you start seeing one certain red thread that comes through? Is it fun? Is it hard? What are the themes? It's going to be different for every culture, but then you're asking a question to your whole team where they're able to see themselves in the culture that you've created, and it's a self-reflection exercise, therefore connecting those individuals to the broader mission and where they see the values lived. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that helps a lot. Also, Tobias has a question. Let's see here. Can you see this, Darcy?
Do you mind
And
just
I'll read.
repeating it?
Yeah. I'll read it to anyone who can't see it. So Tobias says, we're a small remote team, 10 people, and also did some value sessions. But after writing stuff down, the hard part seems putting values into practice. Any advice on that?
Yeah, I mean, if you've written your values down and they're right and you actually believe them, they should be your compass. And I would really encourage you that you can start to shift your values as you go into a market. This doesn't feel right, right? Like there's no problem in going back to the drawing board and saying, this doesn't really feel like us. We wrote this down, but this isn't actually being actionalized. And I think the number one thing is, every time you're making a decision, every time you're hiring, every time that you are just moving in any direction, you come back to those 4 to 6 values. I mean, values should always be memorable. They should be easy to learn. They should also have strong descriptions, because values can be interpreted. So I would say number one is use that as a decision-making framework. That is the number one thing you can be doing with your values. That is your company's North Star. That is your company's compass. It is how you're going to get from one side of Europe to the other side of Europe if you are traveling by train, right? Like that is your map. And so always coming back to that as the core decision maker of your company, because it is a shared set of belief systems and values, can be really, really helpful and supportive to making the right decisions for your company.
I think one thing that we did at my first company to operationalize our values, because at that company it was very much the values were not just something that were written in a document, which they were, but you could feel that was lived by everyone at the company. And one very simple way they did this is every time you did your quarterly performance review or a quarterly feedback, you would be evaluated against those values. So we had 4 values. I forget what exactly they are right now, but there were 4 values, and every time you were asked to evaluate yourself on those 4 values, and my manager would evaluate me against those 4 values. So one of them, for example, was kindness. So it wasn't like a soft thing that was just out there, like written on our website, but he would actually tell me whether or not I'm kind, and he would tell everyone that. And if people were unkind, they would know it. So I think that's one other good way, a simple way of putting things into action.
I think that's huge. And I think another kind of tactical takeaway that hopefully this is helpful for y'all on this call is actually baking questions like that into, if you don't have it yet, but I would highly encourage everybody to have a post onboarding survey. So, 3 weeks after some new employee is onboarded, is asking the new employees, where in your onboarding and your experience thus far here did you see these show up? And you are now getting a new person's view and experience of where the values show up, because we can sometimes be blinded to these experiences because we've been in the company for so long, or we're too close to it, right? When new people are coming in, use that data, use their experience to continuously strengthen the values and strengthen the culture.
Let's see, this is a long one, Florian, but let's see. Florian says, in my perspective, one of the most challenging topics with remote working compared to working on site with colleagues is the bonding part, getting friends with the people you work with every day. What kind of tools can you recommend to create such an environment for remote teams? So I think this goes more in the direction of connection, which is a good segue into the other part of the conversation. Like, how do you, I mean, it's kind of the big question of remote work, probably the biggest nut to crack, but how do you foster connection in a remote team where people can still be friends outside of work and not just be productive together, but actually find a way to connect?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think from my experience, I have had stronger relationships with my remote teammates than I ever have in a co-located office. And that comes a lot from the design of the work experience, right? So part of that, I would say, is really creating shared spaces where the language of the title of those spaces really is the umbrella of the behavior you want to see within them. So there are a lot of things that people from all different cultures connect on. I would say food is one of those. This is a really important one. I would say family is a big one. Parenting is a huge one, the challenges that parents face from all over the world, and being able to kind of vulnerably connect on these things. So for example, just setting up a Slack channel where it says, parents of your company, or a lot of people are caretakers too, caretakers of your company and pets of your company. And as part of onboarding, showcasing, okay, here are the spaces that it's okay to talk about these things. This title of this channel actually gives people permission to talk about these things. And not that you don't have permission to talk about these things across the board, but in remote work, you actually have to define the swim lanes within the channels and the behaviors that you want to see within those channels. So if you're really looking for connection, I would say, where do you want people to connect on? Do you want people to, I'm seeing my marketing team and my customer service team, they feel really disconnected. They feel super siloed. Okay, well, I know there's a lot of families on my marketing team, and I know I have got a lot of parents on my customer service team. Let's put a parents parents channel together, and let's make sure everybody's in there, and just start seeing those connections start to organically formulate. So I'd say that's a very, very basic, kind of easy place to start when you're looking for that. I would also say that synchronous communication is so, in remote work, we can overly synchronously communicate. I would say the times that we're on calls together, whether we're solving a problem or whatever it is, spending 5 to 10 minutes of every single call with an icebreaker. It might sound dumb, but it becomes, I would say, the repetition of building in connection to your culture versus connection being an other than or an extra happy hour to do, frankly, is exhausting, and it's burnout. So I would utilize the time you already have in a way that feels incredibly supportive to create those connections.
How do you do that in a way where people don't start saying something like, Darcy, please don't make us do another icebreaker? How do you keep things, or maybe it's just like the repetition of things that maybe you just kind of force yourself to keep doing it. But any thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's two different ways, right? Like, okay, if people don't want to do an icebreaker, my question is, well, do you want, I'm noticing that these two teams aren't working well together, and we know that trust is kind of the base of a thriving remote team. So how do you suggest that we continue to build trust if this is something you don't want to do? I always
Hmm.
put it back on the individual who's kind of fighting it. Again, you can try other strategies. Something I faced that before, and one thing I did was I just started to host a right before our company call. I started to bake it in every single week. I would just host an informal coffee talk. There were a list of questions. People could show up if they wanted to. I don't know if you guys ever watch Saturday Night Live. It's a little bit more of an American thing. But there's this character, and her name, Mike Myers used to play her, and I used to dress up as her to coffee talk. We all get together and we talk over coffee. And so I'd create kind of a character and this container around it where it felt a little bit not just like, all right, we're just gonna go bond, right? Like, it felt like a different experience. I kind of wrapped this social norm around this experience where people are like, oh wow, this is actually kind of fun. Okay,
Hmm.
I'm going to show up to this. And more people started showing up every week. So I think really starting to get creative, playing with your culture. Does your culture have certain rituals already? Can you embed those rituals into kind of creating connection? So I really focus on, if you're going to use synchronous time, how do you really do 10 times the amount of connection within that time versus creating an other than?
Okay, so to sum up, the three things we talked about is, or might just be two. Let's see. Finding a way to create spaces of finding topics that people have in common, whether it be parenting, food, two very common ones, or finding other ways that to connect people that otherwise might not have a connection about work topics, or maybe they do and they just need an extra space. And then the one like very practical tip was using the communication, the touch points you already have with each other, the meetings you already have with each other, and incorporating bonding into them instead of like trying to have like an extra coffee break or connection time in other meetings.
Yeah, absolutely.
That makes sense. I have to ask this because we do this, but any tech you've seen work well that people are using that they like? You don't have to mention Gomata, but
I was
we can
gonna
take care of
say,
that.
I'm a huge proponent of, a tool is only as good as you use it, right? And I think that in remote work, especially right now, it can be really overwhelming to just add tech on top of one another. We're going to use this now. We're going to learn this tool now. We're going to learn this tool now. So my just kind of knee jerk reaction is, if you're using Zoom, use breakout rooms. They exist in Zoom. Do you have a team of 20 people and you want to do a 5-minute icebreaker? All you need to do is write, let's say, 3 icebreaker questions down. People tend to be a little bit more vulnerable and open up in smaller groups. Break everybody up into groups of 5. Say you have 25 people, break them all up in groups of 5, give them that sheet, have them ask questions to one another, put some rules around it, bring them back into the big room and start your meeting. It's as simple as that. And I think, just again, can you get as creative as possible with the tools you already have? Because adding additional stress to people who might already be introverted or might not want to do this activity, that is just harder to create those connections. So sure, you can integrate new tools when you already have the relationships built, but I think starting with the familiarity of the platforms you already have is probably going to be the most successful outcome.
Yeah, that makes sense. Pretty much in like any other business practice or personal practice, probably too. Like, don't start with tools; they're probably not going to fix all your problems. Start with
Yeah,
the basics,
exactly.
and then use tools to like get even better or put them on top, but they're not going to
Yeah.
form the basis of it. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Um, while we're talking about async and synchronous work, any advice for how do you keep? I think we've heard this from a few people who signed up for Gomada actually in the very beginning when we weren't quite sure what exactly we were doing. Um, like, how do you keep meetings interactive? There was a few people that said I have a hard time keeping people engaged during meetings, which is probably problem in itself of why is the meeting not engaging. But any tips for keeping meetings interactive, and what are your thoughts on async versus meeting culture?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge proponent of async. I think his successful remote first organization is hitting a kind of split of 70% async and 30% synchronous. I think that that's a really, really good metric to, strive for. It's not always going to happen. Um, I love async culture. Keeping meetings engaged, I think, is you got to ask yourself, like, well, one, why are we having this meeting if people aren't engaged, and how do we restructure it? I think really hearing from multiple parties in a meeting. I don't want to just watch one talking head, right? Like that's going to be so boring. Why I can watch that recording. So I think really just asking questions to the audience, ensuring that individuals who are on that meeting are either presenting or there's a way for them to react to content. There's an expectation that there should be a reaction to the content, is incredibly important. And I think that also comes with how do you set people up for success for the meeting? You don't just pop into a meeting and expect everybody to be engaged. Do you put together the agenda and share it with everybody beforehand? Say, I'd like you to react to these points so we can have a discussion as the meeting, right? We can blend async conversation with synchronous meetings and really create that engagement. And hopefully that's a helpful tip of, how to restructure this so there's buy-in and there's that co-creation piece. Like, I don't want to just hear a CEO talk at me for an hour every week. I want to hear from the CEO. I also want to hear from all the teams. I want to know how my work is kind of embedded into the outcomes of the company. So really, how do you create and start thinking about your company as this living, breathing organism where everybody's there to keep the lights on, and really start to create that sense of inclusivity in those meetings?
I almost feel like async and meetings are, or async and synchronous are not really. It's not really one or the other. It's just trying to understand and picking the right tool for the problem that you're trying to solve. And I feel like in the
Yeah.
past, or maybe in my past, I've often gone toward, oh, let's just have a meeting about it. But I think oftentimes there's meetings don't always have to be the better way of trying to solve a problem as a group. Sometimes it's better to just give everyone space on their own and try to solve the problem on their own, and then you can still have a meeting, or try to solve the problem on your own ahead of time and then do a shorter meeting to discuss what your outcomes are, what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. And I think that also comes to the point that I don't hear talked about enough is like neurodiversity. Like we all we all as individuals react to problems differently. We some people react immediately on a meeting and they can speak up, and some people really need time and space to digest information from a meeting and then react to it. And I think that that comes into kind of the space of belonging. Is it you've got to figure out a way to really create that inclusivity of the different ways that people work. It doesn't mean that you can't work together. It's just about really finding the balance and giving people the time and space to show up as their best self and really be able to solve the problem at hand in the way that not only works for them, but for the company as well.
I like that. We also got a question from, I'm going to butcher this name, Jeet. Is that it? I don't know if you want to. You can also unmute yourself. You should be able to and ask the question if you like. And you can add a little context. I know we chatted briefly before this.
Sure. You did not butcher my name, so thanks for that. It is Jeet. Yeah, I think I asked you this question yesterday, so I'll just repeat it for the rest of the group here. So I work for a scale up around 30 people, and my team's about 4 people. It's the sales team. So for me, one of the top challenges, and pre-pandemic, I was used to working, in the office, where you could feel the pulse, feel the vibe, see what people are up to, just get like how motivated they are as well. In a remote setup, of course, we have the weekly one-on-ones and the team meetings, but maybe it's just my expectation, but like I find it really hard to understand what the pulse, what the vibe of the team is. Are they demotivated for some reason? Are they all pumped? So I was wondering if you have any thoughts around kind of gauging what the pulse of the team is, and if it is in fact down for some reason, what are some of the tips that I can use to, boost their motivation?
Yeah, I mean, my first question for you, and hi, Jeet, nice to meet you. I actually live right off the US 101, so I love that poster in your background. One of the first questions I'd ask you, and I'm sorry if this feels like kind of very blunt, but like, have you asked them what motivates them?
From time to time. So this typically happens in the one-on-one. It's not every week that I'm asking them what motivates you and what's keeping you motivated. That's where I feel the pulse. But there are times when maybe a month goes by and this question's not asked. So maybe that's already a starting point.
Yeah, I mean, I think one really kind of simple, especially because you have such a small team, which can really be incredible for building trust. One thing, depending on what tools you use, you can always set up an auto question within whatever tool system you use so that the system just pumps it out. Slack does this, Basecamp does this, a lot of tools do this, of how are you feeling today? Or what's going on in your life that you feel like is stopping you from getting your work accomplished, or something that says, what have you done for you today? Kind of things that really start to see and bring that trust in. Of the more you build that trust, the more people are going to start to open up to you. So one thing I ask people that might not sound worky when they first started a company is, what lights you up out of work? What energizes you? And then knowing those things, then on your one-on-one saying, what have you done this week that has energized you? And where can I help you fill those gaps if you don't feel like you have the time or space to do what's energizing you? Is that helpful? Awesome. Cool.
Darcy, I know you said technology. We can't put technology first, but I'm going to throw some tech out there.
You definitely can't, but yeah.
Gee, there's also a few, I mean, you already mentioned this, Darcy, but a few tools that we've seen, and feel free to put others in the chat that you've tried. I haven't tried all these myself, but Tiny Pulse is one that specializes on just check-ins. I think Heycona does something like that, similarly, that like focuses on Slack check-ins. I have to mention Gomada because we do exactly what Darcy said. Basically, we'll check in with the team via Slack multiple times a week. And it's not just like, how are you feeling? Because that gets a little repetitive and you don't want to tell your boss how you're feeling every day. So we incorporate other questions about like what's going on in your life that you want, like it's not private, that you want to share. What's your energy level, weekend plans. So things like that you can also help you get a feel for how is someone feeling, or is the mood pretty anxious, stressed, or are people seemingly having a good time? It can't replace your one-on-ones, but and it's free. I think I don't know about the other tools. They probably have some kind of free plan, so it's something you can check out.
Thanks so much. Very helpful.
And Darcy, while we're on the topic, and by the way, if anyone has questions, feel free to just raise your hand. Thanks, Jose. We'll see you around. If anyone has questions, just raise your hand or drop them in the chat, like we've done before. Otherwise, I'll keep asking questions. But we're also at the 30-minute mark, so probably spend another 10 minutes or so asking questions, answering questions, unless there's a flood more. But final question I have for you, any resources that you have, especially for, it could be either management or remote management specifically, anything that people can read or watch or listen to after this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I'm a big book bookworm. So there are definitely some tactical kind of books I would recommend. I actually wrote a few of them down because you asked me this. There is a great book by Priya Parker called The Art of Gathering. And when you're asking about how to make meetings more engaging, do your meetings have a purpose? Do they have a structure? Do they have an outcome? And really starting to use design thinking. She uses design thinking to think about how we gather. And a virtual meeting is a gathering, right? So that is a book definitely that I would say will really help you think about meetings differently. So that's a tactical one there. I would say there's a wonderful book by Kim Cameron, and it's called Positive Leadership. That I find to be incredibly helpful in how do you kind of not just stay positive as a leader, because you're going to have bad days too, but how do you create and foster an environment of positive leadership and kind of that psychological safety. And the other one I would say is by Barbara Fredrickson. It is called Energize Your Workplace. And so as I was talking about, how do you create those energizing connections? And I think that this one is really important when we are, we're async and sync both. The moments that we have are so rare and they're so important. So how do we, for lack of a better term, bubble wrap everything so that it feels good and we feel energized by it? So those are kind of my 3 tactical books that I would start with when you're kind of starting in this realm.
Awesome. We'll also add those to like a running list of resources and send those out after. So if you didn't catch them all, we'll send it out.
Yeah.
All right. Marius, what you got?
Thank you. Hi, Darcy. For me, the question is, how do I teach people knowledge when they're really basic in terms of the job, of the new job? So, for example, I get some working students, and in my opinion, I have the feeling when they're personal, then they just can hand over to my place and ask some few or some little questions. And if they're remote at home, they hesitate to ask them to me, because I'm also a lecturer at the DHBW, and I had while Corona I had to take my classes remote, and that was really horrible. I did breakout sessions and everything like that, but in my opinion, they have learned like 60% from from the classes in person.
So do you mind just dialing down like the question? Is it just more I'm just hearing from you, you're having kind of friction with your remote students feeling like they're able to ask questions?
Yeah, and I have the problem, I'm not sure how to teach them right in that part, because normally I just do shadowing, and shadowing for me, it's easier. 1 hour they're next to me, and then they have their short task, and then they come back for a minute question or something like that,
Yeah, I mean, I think again, the kind of one of the questions here is asking your students how they best learn. And are you seeing a theme within how your students best learn? Not everybody learns well remotely. And I think that that's really important to understand as well, is like remote isn't going to work for every individual. I would say in some ways, sometimes it can be harder for kind of entry level, because people don't have a context of what a remote environment can be. So I would encourage you to kind of ask more questions to the individuals. How do you best learn? How can I best support you? What would make this a space that you feel comfortable asking questions, and kind of do a bit of a self-reflection exercise. I see a lot in people who thrive in remote. There are people who have really done a lot of deep self-work. They're self-actualized. Not everybody is there, and that's okay. But you as a teacher and a leader can actually help them along that process, as well as helping yourself.
Okay. Yeah, because in my opinion, at the beginning, the students don't know themselves how they want to learn. Because often I have that part, I ask questions and I don't get any answers. So kind of frustrating, but maybe these are the wrong questions. It's all
Yeah, and I think it's not really about asking questions, it's about asking the right questions. So as you onboard your students, I would encourage you just to create a Google form with how do you best learn? What energizes you? What is the best space for you to ask questions in? And as a part of your course, actually having people go through an onboarding process into your course, so you then have that data. You're seeing the themes of how your class best learns, as well as how individuals best learn. So that would be my encouragement for you. It takes, it'll take you 30 minutes to set up a Google form.
Yes. Yeah.
Integrate it into your class onboarding process.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Got another question from Jeet. Also, something that we discussed last week at Kumara is there a general rule for how much time in your one-on-ones with your reports? How much time should you spend doing work talk, and how much time should you spend like connecting over personal stuff and small talk? Any advice on that, Darcy?
I mean, I think there's a difference between like personal talk and small talk and trust building, right? Like, I think one-on-ones should be 90 to 95% trust building. A lot of work reactions and work things can be done, and I'm not saying trust is not part of work, but can be done asynchronously. And so I really think those one-on-one moments, like the more rapport and the more trust you can build with your reports, the better and the easier these work conversations are going to be. So I would really, really focus and heavily on the trust building section of the one-on-ones, and go from there.
Do you need any follow-ups to that?
It makes sense. I'll have to put this into practice, because at the moment, how we're doing it as a company, as a culture, is we have 60-minute one-on-ones with all our direct reports, and then the first 5 to sometimes even 10 minutes are spent on small talk, just checking in, and then the rest of it is all work talk. Now, the way I see it, the way you explained it, building trust can also be, a factor of talking about work-related topics. So that's the part that I'm still unsure about. But maybe you guys have some other idea.
Yeah,
I mean,
it does. And so I think something that a really good question to ask kind of in those one-on-ones when you're integrating the work piece is, I love this question for people, is what as an employee do you want to start doing? What do you want to stop doing? And what do you want to continue doing, and why? And so really starting each meeting and creating a framework. And I think that comes back to Priya Parker, that comes back to meeting design, that comes back to one-on-one design. Okay, so you want to build in this trust. Am I asking the right questions within this space? An hour is actually a long time, I would say, to do a one-on-one. Can you utilize your time, cut that by half an hour, and build in a little async? So it doesn't mean that you can't talk about work, but what is blocking you from accomplishing your goals? What is the runway that you need to accomplish your goals from? And so again, you get to understand the individual a little bit better while also talking about the work at hand.
Any good resources for one-on-ones, Darcy? Because it's also something, I mean, when you said that, I was like, oh crap. Literally spend all of my one-on-ones talking about work.
That's okay. I love Fellow for one-on-one. So if you haven't used Fellow before, it is a one-on-one kind of agenda planning tool. It integrates into Calendly and Google Calendar, and it allows for both managers and individuals to put in topics. So like, what's great about it is I would build a framework within there for every single one of my direct reports. So the meeting was the same every week. They understood what they were coming into, what we were going to get out of it. But within those categories, there was an opportunity. The framework would be in there. So you'd have a week, because we had weekly one-on-ones, to put in anything you want to talk about. So in there, it'd be, all right, I'd ask my direct reports, is there anything you're going to want to talk about at this meeting? Asynchronously, my reports would put in what they wanted to talk about. And then you as a manager have asked them, you're not just coming to the table saying, hi, we're here for our one-on-one. I'm going to just bombard you with all of these things. You have now kind of opened up the space asynchronously for that individual to come to you with some problems and be able to think about those problems before the meeting. So you could build it via just Google Docs, but Fellow kind of creates that template for it, which I find to be incredibly supportive.
Thanks, Darcy. I'll have to check that out too. Darcy, you got time for one more?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
right.
I have till 8:30, so.
All right. Well, we'll keep doing this. All right. Tina is asking. Sorry, just checking new questions as they're coming in. But Tina's asking. I feel like in the remote world, introverted people have a harder time getting heard or speaking up in meetings. How do you make sure that extroverted people don't take up all the space and all the talking time? And how do you make sure that everyone is equally heard and feels safe?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the reality of remote, right? And it comes back to the neurodiverse kind of piece of this. I think over permitting that it's okay not to speak up and react to the meeting afterwards. I think also not creating meetings in a space that is all about just everybody reacting to something is really important. So I think this comes back to asynchronous communication and saying, okay, for those who didn't speak up or don't feel comfortable speaking up, we're going to post the recording. I would love to hear your reactions after you've had time to process this in an asynchronous way. I think that comes back to how do we build, and asking yourself, how do we build a culture of inclusivity? And how do we help people react and normalize asynchronous reactions to communication? I think one of the reasons this is coming up, and I can't speak for you specifically, but from my experience, we've just normalized extroverts and people talking on meetings. Like that is just normal for a lot of us. That actually isn't how everybody in the world works. And remote has unlocked an opportunity to redesign how we all differently react to meetings and react to things. So it's not a super tactical takeaway, but there are things to think about as you're beginning to redesign your meetings with inclusivity at the core. And
Christos, again, hope I'm not butchering your name. But do you want to ask your question live, or do you want me to read it? If you want to ask it live, just feel free to unmute and ask. It's okay. I can also ask. Christos is just wondering the talk. The talk should it be made in text or verbal? I think he means. I think Christos, you mean one-on-ones. Correct me if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, in one-on-ones, I would definitely use one-on-ones for synchronous communication and kind of video one-on-ones to build that rapport. I wouldn't really say async is best for one-on-ones, just because it's a little bit harder to build trust. It isn't, but it is. But I would really use your video and just your synchronous time that you're syncing with your reports on a weekly or monthly basis, whatever works best for your team, in a video call.
That makes sense. We do the same here. Any other questions from the crowd? I could probably go on and ask 1,000 more, but also want to respect everyone's time. We said we want to keep this to like 30 minutes conversation. So also okay to wrap up here and continue next week. But if you do have any final questions, let me know.
Open book, shoot them my way.
Maybe Darcy, if people have questions or want to connect with you afterwards, what's the best place for them to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So best places to connect with me on LinkedIn. Yeah, feel free to connect with me there and we can continue the conversation.
Sounds good. Thank you, Darcy. This was super, super helpful. I learned a ton. Thank you for joining. Thanks for asking a lot of questions. They were great. Next week, we're going to talk about hybrid teams and how to make sure people feel included in hybrid teams. The week after that, we'll talk about how to put processes in place for your team so you can hand things off and not micromanage. Thank you, Darcy, for the awesome session. We'll send out the recording sometime tomorrow, and along with all the notes and the resources that you gave away.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. And just remember, one thing I always tell myself in leading a remote team is every morning before you log in, just put your lab coat on. You get to experiment. This is a world of blue ocean space, and find what works for you, find what works for your team members, find what works for your culture. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to fail. Create a safe place to fail and just build better. And kudos for you guys for really investing in your remote management skills. Thank you so much for being here.